Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're peeling back the layers, looking past the symbols of political authority, the robes and rituals, to see the actual, the mechanisms of power.
Exactly. And our mission really is to explore this age-old tension. It's the push and pull between the institutions we set up for order laws, senates, assemblies, and the raw power of the military, the ones with the swords.
Yeah, we're looking at systems, both military and legal systems, that were supposedly designed to keep things stable. But what happens? Time again, they seem to become the very things that drive corruption, instability.
Or even outright tyranny. We've gathered quite a range of sources for this one, haven't we?
We have. We're starting way back with the Persian Wars in Greece, looking at how military command worked then Athenian constitutional changes.
And then we pivot hard into the Roman world, the rise of the empire, that absolute military dominance, and also how thinkers like Cicero viewed power, plus the nuts and bolts of Roman law, Gaius, Ulpian, the Digest. It's quite a spread.
Our journey today really is about finding that nipping point, the moment where the protector, the person or group meant to guard the system, suddenly realizes that they hold the real power, not the Constitution, not the people.
It's a transformation that seems almost inevitable sometimes, and it doesn't happen overnight. It starts small, maybe with a little acts of corruption, bending the rules.
And before you know it, the whole basis of governance has shifted.
We're tracing this lineage, the guardians of the state becoming, well, the biggest threat to it.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're better to start than ancient Greece. War, necessity. It's fertile ground for ambition, isn't it?
Right, let's set the scene. Early 5th century BCE, the Persian Wars are raging. We're looking specifically at the moments leading up to the Battle of Artemisium.
Okay, Artemisium. Big naval engagement.
Huge. And the Greeks, they felt massively outnumbered. Even though the Persian fleet had taken some serious hits in a storm just before, the sheer scale of what was left, it was intimidating, to say the least.
So picture this. You're a Greek commander. You see this vast enemy fleet sailing towards you. What's the gut reaction?
According to our sources, pure panic. Understandable, really. The commanders were demoralized. Their immediate instinct was, let's get out of here. Retreat.
They were ready to just abandon the whole position. What about the island they were supposed to be protecting, Euboea?
That's the crux of it. They were prepared to leave Euboea to its fate. It took Themistocles, the Athenian leader, always sharp, always playing an angle, to actually step in and stop them.
Themistocles. So he uses his influence, his force of personality, to hold the line.
Well, yes, but it's more complicated than just persuasion. This is where we see that immediate, almost seamless link between military influence and, frankly, personal financial gain. It sets a really dangerous precedent.
How so? What actually happened?
The Euboeans, the people on the island, they were obviously terrified. If the Greek fleet sailed away, they were done for, overrun instantly.
So they were desperate.
Absolutely desperate. They go straight to Themistocles, and they offer money.
Yeah.
A lot of money. 30 talents.
30 talents. Just given to him. That's an astronomical sum back then. It's not some under-the-table payment, is it? It feels like an open admission that he, Themistocles, holds the real power here, not the allied council or whatever formal structure they had.
That's exactly it. It bypassed all the official channels and the Themistocles. He acts with, let's call it, ruthless efficiency. He doesn't just pocket the 30 talents and say, okay, I'll stay.
What does he do?
He takes the 30. He gives 8 talents, still a huge amount, to his fellow commanders, basically bribing them to change their minds, to get them to stay and fight at Artemisium.
So he buys their compliance, uses the Euboeans' desperation money to secure the military objective.
Precisely. He leveraged the gold to enforce the strategy, and, of course, he kept the remaining 22 talents for himself. A tidy profit. The money, not strategic debate or duty, dictated the outcome.
Wow. So corruption literally saved the day in this instance. But what a precedent. The commander learns his power isn't just military, it's financial, and it can completely override the supposed rules of engagement.
And this sort of corrupted mandate where power and self-interest mix, it doesn't just disappear after the battle, it gets baked into the system, you could say, right after the war ends.
You mean with the founding of the Confederacy of Delos, the Athenian alliance?
Exactly. Look at what happens after the Battle of Mycale, another key Greek victory. The immediate Persian threat is pushed back, but it's not gone entirely. Sparta, which had been the big land power, the traditional leader, well, the sources say they became lukewarm.
Lukewarm. Meaning they weren't so keen on continuing this fight far from home across the Aegean.
Pretty much. It was costly, difficult, far away. So the Ionian Greeks, the ones right there on the coast of Asia Minor and the islands, they start looking elsewhere for leadership, and naturally they turn to Athens. Athens had the navy, the drive.
Okay, so this alliance, the Delian League, it starts out as a mutual defense pact. Pure necessity.
On the surface, yes. The number one goal, the stated objective, was protection, collective security against Persia. But it didn't stop there.
Oh, there's always a but, isn't there?
There usually is when power is involved. The League also decided right from the start that they would actively raid and devastate the Great King's territories.
Okay, strategic attacks maybe? Keep the enemy off balance?
Partly, but the sources are explicit. They mention rapine, looting, plunder. The idea was to accumulate wealth, treasure, as a direct set-off against the expenses and losses of the war. So it's founded on defense, yes, but equally on state-sanctioned raiding for profit.
Collective security meets collective piracy.
And how did Athens manage to turn this necessary evil, perhaps, into the basis of an empire?
Through shrewd administration, particularly financial control, they set up the League's treasury on the sacred island of Delos, neutral ground, symbolically.
Okay, a central treasury. That makes sense for funding joint operations. It does, but here's the critical institutional shift. Originally, the deal was that every member state provides ships for the combined fleet. That implies, shared military effort, some level of parity.
Right, everyone contributes muscle.
But many of the smaller states, the poorer island communities, they simply couldn't afford to build and maintain warships, the triremes. It was incredibly expensive.
So what was the alternative?
Athens came up with one. Instead of providing ships they couldn't afford, these smaller states could pay a yearly sum of money, a phoros, into the Delian treasury.
A cash payment instead of ships.
Exactly. And this total contribution was calculated a massive 460 talents per year, which they figured was the financial equivalent of maintaining about 100 ships.
Okay, I think I see where this is going. The moment you switch from state providing actual military hardware, their own ships, to just sending cash.
They lose their agency, they become dependent, they're not partners in a military alliance anymore, contributing forces. They're essentially paying Athens to protect them, paying for the upkeep of the Athenian navy, which becomes the League's navy.
They traded sovereignty for security, but ended up just funding their protector's dominance.
Precisely. And managing this whole system, collecting the money, required someone trustworthy, someone meticulous. That job fell to Aristides.
Aristides the Just.
Right.
Known for his integrity.
The very same. He was given the incredibly difficult and politically sensitive task of assessing the wealth of every single member city. Think about that, going city by city, figuring out what they could afford to pay, setting their proportional contribution.
That sounds like a bureaucratic nightmare, but also incredibly powerful.
It was the quiet engine of empire building. This valuation, this administrative act, it cemented Athenian financial control over the entire Aegean. It turned what started as a voluntary coalition against Persia into an entity totally reliant on Athenian management and Athenian naval power. The framework for empire was locked in.
So the pattern holds. Military success breeds ambition, ambition leads to financial control, and financial control builds an empire. But empires, even powerful ones like Athens, aren't immune to self-inflicted wounds, are they? The Sicilian expedition comes to mind.
Oh, absolutely. Sicily was a disaster on an epic scale. The sources make it clear the sheer calamity of the Athenian defeat there, the loss of the army, the fleet. It sent shockwaves through the entire Greek world, through Hellas.
What was the immediate impact?
The perception almost overnight was that Athens was finished, shattered, mortally wounded. And that perception became a signal.
A signal for whom?
For everyone who had chafed under Athenian power, their enemies like Sparta and Corinth, neutral states who saw a chance to shift the balance, and crucially, Athens' own subject allies, the ones paying that phoros. They saw this as their moment, their opportunity to break free, to finally shatter Athenian dominance for good.
A moment of weakness, and everyone piles on. And this internal Greek chaos, presumably, didn't go unnoticed by external powers.
Not at all. The great king of Persia, or rather his local governors, the satraps, had been patiently waiting for just such an opportunity. This internal squabbling was exactly what they needed.
So the old enemy sees a chance to get back in the game.
Immediately. The sources name two satraps in particular, Tissaphernes, down in Sardis, and Pharnabazus, up near the Hellespont. They saw Athens reeling, Sparta ascendant, and realized this was their chance.
The chance to do what? Support Sparta.
Precisely. Align with Sparta, provide money, resources, encourage Athens' remaining allies in Asia Minor to revolt. Their goal, to use the Greeks' own self-destructive conflict to claw back the coastal territories Persia had lost decades earlier.
It's quite ironic, isn't it? The Greeks fight tooth and nail to expel Persia, build an alliance supposedly to keep them out.
And then their own ambitions, their inability to manage their power struggles, just opens the door right back up for the very power they feared. It's a stark lesson in how internal divisions can undermine even the greatest military successes.
Okay, so the Greek experience shows us, alliances formed out of necessity, quickly getting warped by ambition and money. But when we turn to Rome, especially the shift from republic to empire, it feels like a whole different scale. Here, the military doesn't just influence the state.
It arguably becomes the state. The lines just blur completely.
And the pivotal moment here has to be Actium, right? The final showdown.
Absolutely. After Actium, Octavianus, soon to be Augustus, stands alone. He is the undisputed master of the Roman world. The sources are incredibly stark about this. The fate of literally everyone depended entirely on his will. No committee, no Senate debate that truly mattered anymore. Just him.
And underpinning that will wasn't, the old Republican ideal of the citizen soldier temporarily taking up arms. It was something new, something harder.
Completely different. He commanded something like 44 legions, veteran legions, and these weren't farmers heading back to their fields after a campaign. They were professionals.
Professionals, what did that mean in practice?
It meant they were hardened soldiers. The sources say they'd spent the last 2 decades becoming habituated to every act of blood and violence. Think about the brutality of the civil wars that preceded Actium. That was their life.
And their loyalty wasn't to an abstract idea like the Republic?
Not primarily. Their loyalty was intensely personal. It was to Caesar first, Julius, then Octavianus, his heir. Why? Because they expected their rewards directly from him. Their retirement bonus, the plots of land they'd been promised, all of that flowed from the house of Caesar. Break that link, and their future vanished.
That's the absolute key, isn't it? Loyalty shifts from the state, the res publica, to the person, the general, the emperor.
And this professional army, utterly loyal to him and him alone, becomes the rock-solid foundation for the new system, the monarchy, the empire. Everything else rests on that military control.
But what's fascinating is how this military takeover wasn't necessarily met with universal outrage or resistance. In fact, large parts of the population seemed almost relieved.
It's surprising, isn't it? But yes, the sources suggest a significant level of acceptance, even desire for this new order. And that acceptance really hammered the final nails into the coffin of the old Republican oligarchy.
Why, though? Why would people accept, even welcome, what looks like a military dictatorship?
Well, think about the state of the late Republic from the perspective of someone living in the provinces, say in Greece or Asia Minor. For decades, they'd been subjected to the whims of Republican governors. These weren't centrally controlled administrators. They were often senators out to make a fortune during their short term.
Basically, petty tyrants, as the sources call them, operating with little oversight.
Exactly. Rapacious, often corrupt, seeing their province as a personal piggy bank. So from the perspective of the provincials, the sources say they actually side for the government of a single person.
Really? They wanted an emperor.
They preferred one master, potentially far away in Rome, but with ultimate authority, to dozens of these unaccountable local governors. A single ruler might possibly offer more predictable justice, a check on that local tyranny. He'd be the master of the petty tyrants, not their accomplice.
Okay, that makes a certain grim sense.
Mm-hmm.
What about back in Italy? Were the wealthy elites there fighting for the old freedoms?
Not really, no. The sources paint a picture of exhaustion. The rich Italians, many influenced by philosophies like Epicureanism, increasingly valued peace, quiet, tranquility above all else.
They just wanted stability after decades of civil war.
Precisely. They didn't want the pleasing dream of peace, as one source puts it, to be interrupted by the memory of their old tumultuous freedom. Freedom, in the context of the late Republic, had come to mean chaos, proscriptions, endless violence.
So stability, even under one-man rule, seemed like the better bargain.
For many, yes. The old system, the traditional ruling class, had failed so profoundly, so catastrophically, that it left a vacuum. And Augustus, with his legions, stepped right into it. The door was wide open for military control because the alternative seems so much worse. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the monarchy Augustus built wasn't just strong because he won the Battle of Actium. It was strong because the Republic had fundamentally lost the consent, or at least the active support, of huge swaths of its population, both in the provinces and in Italy itself. The army was the tool, but societal exhaustion, the desperate desire for order, was arguably the fuel.
And Augustus was smart enough to know he couldn't just rule by brute force alone, right? He needed the appearance of legitimacy, the connection to the past.
Absolutely. He masterfully blended his absolute military power with the symbols of the old republic. Think about the emperor's official imagery. It always included the consular fasces.
The bundle of rods with the axe, symbolizing the power to command and punish.
Exactly. The imperium. Displaying the fasces implied the constant legal presence of the lictors, the traditional attendants and bodyguards of high magistrates. So Augustus projected this image of continuity, of holding traditional republican office, while simultaneously being the sole commander of 40-plus legions. It was a brilliant balancing act.
But that balance couldn't last forever, could it? Over time, the pretense of being just the first citizen among equals must have worn thin.
It did. As the empire solidified, especially under later emperors, that veneer of republican collegiality often vanished entirely. It gets replaced by raw, undisguised, top-down imperial command. Domitian is a fantastic example of this.
Domitian, known for being autocratic, even paranoid, right?
Very much so. And the sources give us these little vignettes that show his exceptional arrogance, his deliberate distancing of himself from the populace, even in how he handled simple public requests.
Like what? If a crowd gathered in the forum, shouting demands.
Imagine a large crowd demanding something. Maybe they want a particular senator who's fallen out of favor restored, or perhaps lower taxes, who knows? How does Domitian respond? Does he come out? Does he send a representative to negotiate?
Based on his reputation, probably not.
Not even close. He demonstrates his profound reserve, his distance, by simply having his official herald the praeco, basically a public announcer, step forward.
And the herald delivers the emperor's message.
The herald delivers one message: silence. Just orders the entire crowd to be silent. That's it.
Wow. No engagement, no explanation, just shut up.
It's more than just rudeness, though. It's a calculated display of power. It says, I am so far above you, your demands are irrelevant noise. My will is transmitted downwards through my designated mouthpiece. There is no conversation. The power flows strictly one way.
Okay, so we've seen power consolidating at the very top, the emperor backed by his legions. But let's shift focus now to the everyday level. How did these ancient states actually maintain law and order on the streets? And how did their systems of policing and law either, limit or actually amplify the power of the state? Let's start with Athens, which seems quite different.
It really is a stark contrast to Rome. Athenian state policing, if you can even call it that, was remarkably limited. Their main force for keeping order in public spaces was a group known as the Scythian archers.
Scythian archers. And the key thing about them was
they were public slaves, owned by the state itself.
Slaves, not citizens. That seems significant.
It's hugely significant. It tells you a lot about Athenian attitudes towards coercive power within the city. They seemed reluctant to grant that kind of routine physical enforcement authority to their own citizens. Giving it to state-owned slaves created a distance, a buffer.
Okay, so what did these Scythian archers actually do?
Their job was basically peacekeeping, but only in very specific designated public areas. They'd be present in the agora, the marketplace, maybe on the Pnyx Hill during assembly meetings, in the law courts. Crowd control, essentially.
And who told them what to do? Did they act independently?
Absolutely not. That's another crucial limitation. They acted only on the explicit orders of elected officials, the Prytanius, the rotating executive committee, or the Boule, the Council of 500. They had no initiative of their own.
So what didn't they do? What does their role tell us about Athenian ideas of order?
Well, the big thing is they didn't patrol the streets routinely, day or night. They weren't out looking for trouble. They weren't detectives. They didn't launch investigations or prosecutions.
So if there was a crime, a fight, who dealt with it?
The Athenian ideal, or at least the practice, relied heavily on citizen self-help. If you saw something happening, you were expected to intervene, raise the alarm, maybe grab the offender yourself. The Scythians were a visible symbol of state order, but they were fundamentally passive responders, not proactive enforcers. It reflects a deep-seated Athenian distrust of a permanent internal police force with broad powers.
Okay, limited, slave-based, reactive crowd control. Now let's flip to Rome. It sounds like a completely different universe. Rome seems to have used the law itself as a much more active, even transformative tool of state power, especially through the figure of the praetor.
That's a great way to put it. Roman law started out, according to the sources, as a very stiff system of technical and ceremonious law. Think rigid formulas, specific rituals you had to perform exactly right to bring a case. Very inflexible.
Sounds like a system that could easily lead to injustice just because someone didn't use the magic words, right? Or couldn't handle a new situation.
Exactly. It struggled to adapt. But then you have the praetor. These were high-ranking magistrates, and crucially, they were granted what the sources call supplementary royal authority, power derived from the old kings, basically.
And what did that allow them to do?
Each year, the praetor issued an edict. And in this edict, he could essentially introduce new legal remedies, new types of lawsuits, new defenses, things that weren't in the original strict civil law. See, nice? Civil.
So he could effectively create new law, or at least new ways of applying it.
Pretty much. The idea was that the praetor's edict would gradually bend the old, stiff law into supposed accordance with the law of nature, the Philor Natural or Offeldius Gentium, the law common to all peoples. This introduced concepts of fairness, equity, good faith, bona fides into the system.
So the praetor acted as a kind of judicial innovator, making Roman law flexible enough to govern a huge, diverse empire.
Precisely. It was a key mechanism for Roman legal development and adaptation. But this flexibility, this power, vested in a single magistrate, especially when backed by the ultimate military authority of the emperor, also created dangers, didn't it? Particularly out in the provinces far from oversight.
Absolutely. If the local governor is the law, or can bend it easily, what protects the average Roman citizen living, say, in Ephesus or Antioch?
That's where another crucial Roman legal concept comes in. The provocatio ad populum, or the right of appeal. This was meant to be a fundamental shield for Roman citizens.
And appeal to whom?
Originally to the people's assemblies in Rome, later effectively to the emperor or his courts. It specifically protected citizens against governors wielding their capital jurisdiction, the power over life and death, or using excessive violent coercion like scourging.
So if a provincial governor sentenced a Roman citizen to death, the citizen could shout civis Romana sum and demand
to have his case heard back in Rome, not by the governor who condemned him, but by the proper courts, usually staffed by the senatorial or equestrian orders, ordo. It was designed as a check on precisely that kind of arbitrary, distant power, a safeguard against the petty tyrants the provinces had supposedly escaped.
Okay, so there's a system of checks and balances, at least in theory. But did it always work? How much actual protection did provocatio offer against a governor determined to be harsh?
That's the difficult question. The sources suggest that even with provocatio, there was still considerable latitude for severity, provided it stayed within the bounds of the law. The line between strict legal discipline and outright brutality could be very thin.
Is there an example of this?
There's a famous incident involving Galba before he became emperor when he was serving as a provincial governor. He was known for being a strict disciplinarian. He condemned a man, presumably a citizen, who had appealed or could appeal to crucifixion. Now, crucifixion was seen as a particularly degrading, painful death, usually reserved for slaves or rebels. The condemned man apparently protested, expecting the cleaner, quicker death by the sword, which was more typical for citizens facing execution.
He appealed the method of execution.
Exactly. He wasn't necessarily denying his guilt, but appealing the sheer severity and type of punishment. But the sources seem to imply that Galba, in his role as a strong disciplinarian, was likely within his legal rights to impose crucifixion in that specific case. It's cited as an example of his exceptional severity, but not necessarily an illegal act.
So the system might protect you from blatantly unlawful actions, but it didn't necessarily shield you from incredibly harsh, yet technically legal, punishment.
That seems to be the case. The provocatio was a barrier against rogue governors acting completely outside the law, but the law itself, especially military or provincial disciplinary law, could still be brutally severe.
This whole discussion, the praetor aiming for this lofty law of nature, while governors can still legally crucify people, it highlights a real paradox, doesn't it? The system strives for abstract justice on one hand, but seems perfectly comfortable with systemic injustice on the other.
And you see that systemic injustice nowhere more clearly than when you look at who the law didn't protect, or rather who it actively defined as being outside its main protections.
Who are we talking about?
We're talking about people defined in Roman law as being alien aioris, under the power of another. This primarily meant adult sons still under their father's authority, the paterfamilias, wives in certain types of marriage in manu, and, of course, slaves.
What were their legal limitations?
The jurists like Gaius are very clear. Individuals under power generally could not own property in their own right. Anything they acquired typically belonged to the head of the household. And if you can't own property, you generally can't sue in court to reclaim property or enforce contracts in your own name. You were legally isolated in many crucial respects.
Wait, so an adult son, maybe even a magistrate himself, couldn't technically own his own possessions if his father was still alive?
In the strictest sense of the old law, yes. The paterfamilias held the power. Now, there were practical workarounds and developments over time, like the peculium, assets the father allowed the son to manage, but the fundamental legal principle remained potent for centuries.
How does that square with the praetor trying to align law with nature and equity? It seems fundamentally inequitable to deny legal personhood to huge segments of society.
It shows us that equity and nature were often interpreted in ways that reinforced the existing social and power structures. The system protected the property and authority of the paterfamilias, like head of the household, who was legally autonomous.
And if someone under power committed a crime, say a son damaged someone's property,
The legal action wasn't primarily against the son himself, it was against the father, the one who held potesta's power over him. The father might have to pay damages, or he could choose to noxally surrender the son to the injured party. The son wasn't the primary legal target.
so the very framework of Roman law defined who counted, who had rights, and who was essentially an extension of someone else's legal personality. Law and order inherently protected the powerful and left the powerless largely outside its direct shield.
Exactly. The system wasn't designed for universal equality. It was designed to maintain the established hierarchy, albeit with mechanisms like the praetor's edict to make it function more smoothly for those who mattered within that hierarchy.
Okay, so we've seen how military success can corrupt alliances in Greece and how professional armies and evolving legal systems concentrate power in Rome. But underpinning all of this seems to be a fundamental human issue. The moment power gets concentrated, it becomes incredibly vulnerable to, well, basic self-interest.
It really does seem to be the weak point in almost any system, doesn't it? And the ancient thinkers were acutely aware of this. Cicero, for instance, writing during the chaotic end of the Roman Republic, had some very sharp insights into this.
What was Cicero's take? He was right in the thick of it, after all.
He starts with a pretty fundamental observation about human nature. He says that human beings, above all, both benefit and hurt other human beings. Our interactions are inherently double-edged. We rely on each other, but we're also the greatest threat to each other.
That feels undeniably true. So how does politics or virtue in public life fit into that?
For Cicero, true virtue, especially for someone in a position of influence, involves several key things. First, perceiving the truth, understanding reality clearly. Second, and this is absolutely vital for our discussion, is the ability to restrain what he calls turbulent mental activity.
Turbulent mental activity, what does that mean?
He's talking about the passions, the emotions, the raw appetites, what the Greeks called pathy. Ambition, greed, anger, fear, all those things that can cloud judgment and drive irrational action. True virtue requires making these passions obedient to reason.
So self-control is fundamental. You can't govern others if you can't govern yourself.
That's the core idea. And the third element. Cicero says virtue involves using your associates, the people you work with, moderately and skillfully to help achieve your goals, your interests.
Okay, using people skillfully, but moderately. That sounds like a kind line.
It is. For Cicero, political success is about winning people over, harnessing their talents and loyalty. But the danger, the constant temptation, is that if you fail to restrain those turbulent passions, if unchecked ambition or greed takes over, you stop using people moderately and start exploiting them. You cross the line from leadership into tyranny. Self-interest, unchecked, corrupts the whole enterprise.
And when you take that unchecked self-interest and give it the backing of, say, 44 loyal legions and the power of the praetor's edict, what happens then?
Then you get the environment of the Roman Empire under certain emperors. The potential for arbitrary cruelty just skyrockets. Political risk stops being about policy debates or public opinion and becomes intensely personal, focused entirely on the whims and fears of the man at the top.
We talked about Domitian's arrogance. Did this climate of fear manifest in other ways?
Absolutely. The sources describe Domitian's later reign, for example, as marked by a kind of savagery, but it was often tempered by an equally erratic and decidedly macabre sense of humor. It's this terrifying unpredictability. When the ruler's personal feelings are the law, justice becomes capricious, frightening.
Here's where it gets really interesting. How did this play out legally? We hear about treason laws, lèse majesté.
Right, the concept of majestas, or lèse majesté, injuring the majesty of the Roman people, or later, the emperor became an incredibly flexible and dangerous tool. It could be stretched to cover almost any perceived slight or criticism.
And it wasn't just about, say, plotting a coup.
Oh, no. It could be far more subtle, far more personal. We have the case, perhaps anecdotal, but illustrative, of the poet Juvenal.
The satirist. What happened to him?
According to some accounts, Juvenal was exiled, not for publishing some scathing satire against the emperor or powerful court figures, which you might expect,
Then for what?
for merely reciting some offending lines privately. At a dinner party, maybe, just among friends, he hadn't even published it. But someone present, perhaps an informer, a day later, they were called, reported it.
Just for reciting lines in private, that could get you exiled.
Potentially, yes. If true, it shows the incredibly low threshold for what could be deemed lèse-majesté. The political danger wasn't just about overt opposition in the Senate or the Forum. It extended right into your private life, your conversations, your unguarded moments.
That's terrifying.
Yeah.
It means the state's power, the emperor's paranoia, reached everywhere. Survival wasn't just about obeying laws. It was about psychological submission, wasn't it? Constantly watching what you say, even to friends.
Absolutely. Avoiding offense, anticipating the emperor's moods, placating his inner circle that becomes the primary political skill. Any notion of independent civic duty just withers away under that kind of pressure. Self-preservation trumps everything.
Thinking about that kind of suffocating atmosphere makes the Athenian approach seem, well, almost quaint by comparison, but maybe also quite wise in its own way.
It does stand in stark contrast. The sources suggest that Athenian public discourse, Athenian democracy, was acutely aware of this constant tug of self-interest on every individual citizen. They didn't pretend it didn't exist.
But their solution wasn't informants in treason trials for private remarks.
Generally, no. Their preference, their method, was different. They aimed to elicit good citizenship, not just compel it. They relied on persuasion, public debate, rhetoric, the power of argument in the assembly and the courts.
Trying to convince citizens that acting for the common good was actually in their own long-term interest.
Exactly. They preferred that approach, appealing to reason, honor, shared identity, rather than relying primarily on coercion and the constant fear of the laws, which was seen as more characteristic of places like Sparta or, indeed, later imperial Rome.
It really highlights that fundamental difference, doesn't it? A system built around trying to manage self-interest through conversation versus a system built around suppressing dissent through fear and overwhelming power.
And it brings us right back to the central theme we've been tracing throughout this deep dive. These structures we create for order, whether it's the Delian League's treasury designed for collective defense, Augustus's professional legions meant to end civil war, or the praetor's legal authority intended to create flexible justice.
They all seem to have this built-in vulnerability.
They inevitably become tools. Tools for accumulating personal wealth, like Themistocles or the Athenian empire builders. Tools for securing absolute political control, like Augustus. Tools for silencing opposition and eliminating rivals, as seen under emperors like Domitian through laws like lèse-majesté.
The proximity of power, especially military power, to the mechanisms of state control just creates this constant, unavoidable risk. The protectors become the predators.
We've seen it play out repeatedly. Ambition finds cover in necessity. Commanders use bribes. Emperors rule through the silent threat of their guards and legions. Jurists bend legal principles to serve the consolidation of state power, even while talking about nature and equity.
It seems the real story isn't always about the ideals a system proclaims, like justice or order or defense. It's more about who actually controls the resources, who commands the loyalty of the armed forces, and, crucially, who gets to define the legal terms that justify their actions.
The consolidation of power is never just about winning on the battlefield. It's about embedding that power within institutions, financial, legal, military, that ensure the benefits flow consistently towards those who hold the reins, often at the expense of the very people or principles the system was supposedly created to protect.
So the history we've looked at is less about a clean line between law and force, and more about the constant, messy entanglement of the two. Who holds the sword ultimately shapes the law.
This raises an important question. We talked about the Roman praetor supposedly moving law away from rigid formulas towards more flexible concepts like equity and the law of nature. On the surface, that sounds progressive, right? More just.
It does sound like an improvement over purely technical law.
But does a system based on these more abstract, flexible ideals, nature, equity, good faith, actually serve as a better check on the ambitions of those who hold the real hard power, the military power? Or does it just give them more sophisticated, more adaptable justifications for doing whatever they wanted to do anyway? Does flexibility in law empower the judge or the general standing behind the judge?